Right, welcome to another IAEI News Live. My name's Thomas Dimitrovich, and it's early on Tuesday morning, and I'm recording this session, so please forgive me. Today, we're going to continue our discussion on 70E second draft changes. So this is very close to what the second draft or what the final edition is going to look like, minus some minor details. So we're going to talk about this document, and we're going to hit it now. All right, welcome back. Hopefully you're going to have a great day today. I think you will. So, and this is, you're watching this at 12 o'clock, so you're halfway through your day, as am I, but I'm in a meeting at this time. So hopefully I'll be able to tune in while I do this discussion. So let's do this. Last week we talked about, we went through, we got into Article 130, I believe, for NEC NFPA 70E 2024 edition. This is post second draft meeting, so they're in that process mode where they're moving into the annual meeting and get the acceptance of that next year, and then it will become a document at the end of next year. So, in my opinion, there were some interesting changes made to 70E, again, emphasizing the importance of establishing that electrical safe work condition, elevating the awareness of that and the importance of that. In addition, you got to remember that 70B on maintenance. So 70B is the document, the NFPA reference document that we use for maintenance, and maintenance plays a very important role in safe work practices. So we're going to hopefully get through Chapter 1 today and get into Chapter 2. If you didn't catch the first version of this second draft report, please go check that one out. I gotta make sure I have my clock. So, all right. So let's take a look. And okay, so 70B plays an important role, and I'm gonna hopefully get into Chapter 2, which is maintenance, because I'd love to have a discussion with you, and I'd love your feedback and get your input on this concept. How does 70, the National Electrical Code, 70B on maintenance, and 70E, how do they dovetail together? How do we create those links in each of these documents to help us understand the importance that they bring to the table as a unit? You need all three from a safety perspective. So anyway, hopefully my buttons work here. So we're going to talk about 70E. Bringing my talking paper over here. And we need our spectacles. All right, so we're going to talk about 70E changes. Now, we went, and if you recall last week, we chatted about the importance of the Manual of Style. These are three key documents that you need to be aware of. And in my opinion, you should read these. You should read that Manual of Style for NFPA committees, read the NEC Style Manual, because 70E is a document that falls under the umbrella of the NEC Style Manual. And I know, I mean, I wish they didn't call it the NEC Style Manual, but here's the other thing. You got to remember, that not only does 70E fall under the NEC style manual, the NEC falls under this NEC style manual, but 70B does not. So when you flip over to 70B on maintenance, you're going to see a different structure. Definitions aren't in Article 100. There is no Article 100, right? So you can go, in fact, you can go pop out to the NFPA website, nfpa.org/70B as in Bob. Take a look at the current edition, and you'll see something a little different than what you see in the NEC, which begs the question of, do we have to bring that document under the NEC style manual, especially since it's a trilogy? I call it a trilogy. I don't know. You may or may not agree with that language. Anyway, we talked about the global changes last week. We talked about things moving to Article 100. The other thing that I didn't mention in here, which we're going to see, I think, a lot of as we move through finish 130 and get into Chapter 2. The committee, there was a public input, and we did talk about it last time as well, but I didn't note it here as a global change, but it dawned on me recently that really it is a global change. The committee had a discussion about shock and the whole term shock hazard. They elected to add a little more clarity, recognizing that it's an electric shock hazard, not just a shock hazard. There are other uses of the term shock, and if you are involved with, at any degree, with codes and standards, at any degree with the development of documents or even legal documents, little words that add clarity go a long way. You may not experience the debate and issues with the terminology, but others have. So in any case, that is another global change that occurred throughout the code. Anywhere where we say shock hazard or we use the word shock, it was reviewed and supplemented or enhanced with the word electric or electrical shock, electric shock, for clarity, where appropriate. Yep, there it is right there. So this, and it was a global change, so I did cover that. Sorry about that. I did not recall covering that as a global change. Anyway, we went through Article 90. I'm just going to flip through here. So there were a lot of structure changes. We already talked about this. We talked about the addition of scope and what that does, and I believe there is a way, for me, there it is. I can do this. And I am going to come back to where I believe we left off. And I believe it was right in here. If you recall, remember this discussion. We were talking, when we left off, we were in this OSHA document talking about the whole concept of shock boundaries, right? So we were in 130.4 shock boundaries, and they made some changes to some of the numbers, and they referenced a table out of OSHA. Now, out of OSHA documentation. So there's actually a live line work minimum approach distances, and there's calculations in that regard. Gotta make sure this other computer stays up because I have my first draft and second draft up there. So there was a calculation. We talked a little bit about this. This is what we ended on, and we gave you the reference for this. So if you want to know more about this, go back to the first revision of this, the second draft, part one, we'll call it. Part one, I think is what I call it. So we talked about the live line work minimum approach distances and the calculations and the changes that were made in the tables for to accommodate these numbers and these equations and whatnot. So, and I believe this was our last slide. Limited approach boundary. You have those three conditions. And again, advise was changed to warn, and it adds clarity but doesn't change the intent. They removed the words warn him or her to be gender neutral and gender neutral. Reference added to 130.80 on the first subdivision to 130.8. So those were the changes in 130.4. And we were moving into 130.5. So that's where I want to pick up our discussion today. Is the arc flash risk assessment. And what you're seeing here is anything that is highlighted in red saw some changes. Some of those are minor, some of those a little bit more than minor. But suffice it to say those are changes. But here's what I want you to look at. Look at how it's laid out. So arc flash risk assessment is separated into general. You have to estimate the likelihood and severity of an arc flash event. You have to look at additional protective measures. You have to look at documentation, arc flash boundaries, the arc flash PPE, incident energy analysis method, and then there's the equipment labeling. So, as I was walking through this as I was, just trying to get ready for our discussion today, I had this, I don't know, I just had this feeling that from an arc flash risk assessment, what are we doing in an arc flash risk assessment? We are trying to determine likelihood and severity. We're not determining PPE, in my opinion. And the reason I say that is because if you look at this outline, you're estimating likelihood. I'm going to just call up 130. I'm going to look at I got the second draft here, 130.5. So in the very first section, 130.5A is general. They have an arc flash risk assessment shall be performed, 1, to identify the arc flash hazards, 2, to estimate the likelihood of an occurrence or of injury or damage to health and the potential severity of injury or damage to health. And then 3 is to determine if additional protective measures are required, including the use of PPE. It just, in my opinion, I think that this would fare better if we just talked about the risk assessment and not PPE in 130. This is just how I'm talking. Remember, what comes out of here started up here, but it comes from here. I think that here's my, as you walk through NFPA 70E, you're going to see that a lot happens right here in Article 130. Chapter 1 is like the largest chapter of this entire book. And everybody focuses in on a few sections. But the arc flash risk assessment, there's two things happening. One, you're estimating the likelihood of occurrence. You're estimating the magnitude of the event, right? And then also in 130.5, you're picking your PPE. Although, even though 130, even though, so you're doing everything in 130 with regard to arc flash. You are identifying the hazard and you are creating all your boundaries. You are picking your PPE. That's in Article 130. 130.5 is supposed to be arc flash risk assessment. But you're doing more than just the arc flash risk assessment. So in Article 130 is work involving electrical hazards, right? In 130.5, you have your arc flash risk assessment. In 130.7, you have personal and other protective equipment. But there is PPE and other protective equipment in 130.5 as well. So in my opinion, I think that I don't know. I'm just thinking that there's an opportunity. Not sure what it is yet. So anyway, suffice it to say. So let's take a look. Estimate. So general, from a 130.5 perspective, we know we have a general, the 130.5A, we have general, which is basically giving you your, it should be scope. Well, we have a scope 130.1. So 130.5A is basically telling us what this article is going to do, or what this section is going to do. 130.5B is your estimate of likelihood and severity. And what B tells us is, and I note that it changed here. B says, the estimate of the likelihood of occurrence of injury or damage to health and the potential severity of injury or damage to health. He has to take into two items: the design of the electrical equipment, including its overcurrent device and its operating times. Now, this is likelihood and severity, and I would say the design of the electrical equipment, the including its overcurrent devices and operating times, is a severity play. Right? That's a severity play. The design of the electrical equipment itself could be a likelihood play as well. Or that, if I was going to separate B1 into two items, I would say B1 is a little bit of both likelihood and severity, because the type of the equipment could play a role. The size of the equipment. What do we know about arc flash? We know that the smaller enclosures funnel that energy out, so that can cause higher incident energy, which is a magnitude. The configuration of the bus, based on IEEE 1584, helps with, or doesn't help with, but it does impact severity, but also likelihood. Because of the work that you're doing in the type of equipment, the complexity, etc., could increase likelihood of a problem. The second item there is the electrical equipment operating condition and condition of maintenance. So there's your 70, there's your 70B type of reference. And then the operating condition, again, that's the functions that are going on. I mean, you got to think about transfer switches, etc. And I would almost argue, and I put down as a possible change in 130.5, is that it's not just the electrical equipment operating condition, but it could be the system operating condition. That's not a part of this language in the latest edition, but it is something that we need to be considerate of. So the changes that we saw in 130.5, hold on. The changes that we saw in 130.5 B, they added, so there's an informational note to 130.5 B that was not there previously. The informational note reads, in most cases, closed doors do not provide enough protection to eliminate the need of PPE in situations in which the state of the equipment is known to readily change, doors opening or closed, racked in, racked out, etc. Now, that note was not previously there in 130.b. That note actually came from 130.7 Charlie 15B. So what is 130.7? That's personal and other protective equipment. So what the committee realized was that that informational note, which really talks about the fact that closed doors do not provide enough protection in some cases, in most cases, to eliminate the need for personal protective equipment, when the equipment is not maintained, etc. That's more of an arc flash risk assessment. So they placed that informational note to be 130.5b estimate of likelihood and severity. In addition, that's the only change that they made in addition. That's the only change they made. So A didn't change. B is the addition of a new informational note, but again, it's just relocating an informational note that they felt only pertained to an arc flash risk assessment. All right, so D did not change documentation. But, C did change. C changed. D didn't change, but we have to pick up C. So 130.5C, additional protective measures. If you look at, I've got two mouses. If you look at, let me just do a quick scroll down, because some of this occurred in the first draft. Some of this occurred in the second draft. (130.5). Okay, 130.5C. This was a first draft change, which there's another video series on this, but I'll just remind you now. They changed the title of, in table 130.5C, this is where we estimate the likelihood of an occurrence of an arc flash incident for AC and DC systems. So in this table, you consider what is the activity that that's going on. What is your action? And then it tells you whether or not there is a likelihood of an arc flash incident or not. The first column used to say equipment condition, which was really tied into a maintenance thing, right? That was the first, the second column. The first column's task. The second column was equipment condition, but they changed that to operating condition. And you might say, boy, that's a little confusing. But if I'm not mistaken, operating condition was another discussion. So you've got to go back to operating condition to understand what they mean by that change. And hold on, I'm just gonna call that up. So if you look in 110, I couldn't remember what section. I believe it's 110.4. Just trying to find it. 110.4. It's not 110.4. We moved a few things around. It's not 110.5. And here, nope, that's not it either. We moved a few things around, and what you've got to remember is they've redefined operating condition. And what you're looking for is the discussion around normal operating condition. So what we did with what is normal operating condition, they threw in the condition of the equipment. So the title of this used to be equipment condition, but because of the changes around what is normal operating condition, they had to change that title. So you didn't quite lose what we had before, meaning if my equipment is in bad repair would have been the previous discussion. There's other factors associated with that topic. All right. Okay, so I'm just making sure I've got all of those discussions. All right, so the title of that was moved from equipment condition to operating condition. There's a reference note. There is a reference note that was moved from 110.4D to 110.2D. Maybe that was the section I was actually looking for. I was hunting and pecking here, but I didn't see a D. Yeah, 110.2 is your electrically safe work condition. It tells you, it actually should be B. That's what they did. So, all right. So remember, there was a section, and they changed 110.2, and I completely forgot about this. 110.2, you got to go back and take a look at that section too. It's easy to forget these things. They're talking about in 110.2, the electrically safe work condition. Right? And it tells you when it's required. So they're focusing on establishing that electrically safe work condition. So what used to be in 110.4D that was moved to 110.2C, 110.2C was merged into 110.2B as an exception. And the exception says normal operation of electrical equipment shall be permitted where normal operating condition exists. And the normal operating condition, remember, that's a part of that table. And it says a normal operating condition exists when all of the following conditions are satisfied. The equipment is properly installed. So it's not just about the equipment condition. So equipment condition, your mind may automatically go to maintenance. But equipment condition, which is now operating condition, so its normal operating condition exists when all of the following are satisfied. The equipment is properly installed, the equipment is properly maintained, there's your maintenance, equipment is rated for the available fault current. I would argue that if it wasn't properly installed, but it is what it is. The equipment is used in accordance with instructions included. Now this is used in accordance. So this isn't an installation requirement. This isn't a maintenance issue. This is the use of the equipment being used in accordance with the instructions from the manufacturer. The doors are closed and secured, which is not I guess you could say equipment condition. I mean, it is a condition. The doors are open, but in reality, it's an operating. It's a part of an operating condition. All equipment covers are in place and secures, and there's no evidence of impending failure. So that was a roundabout way. So 130.5C, that title of that table, changed, and in reality, was 110.4D, moved to 110.2, and it's to 110.2C, and then 110.2C just went away because they melded that in with 110.2B. What a journey, if you think about what a journey that section has had. And then the informational notes were modified in 130.5C. The informational note number 1, 4, and 5 was corrected to align with the style manual. So those are all style manual changes. Also, the reference to 130.5H3 in note B was modified to point to 130.3H to accommodate the restructuring. So no change in the intent. Remember, just like what we just saw here, where I was looking for 110.2C. I'm like, oh, it's not there. And I'm like, oh, I'm freaking out. I completely forgot. They melded that in with B. So there were structure changes throughout 70E, and you'll find that a lot of the notes point to different sections. And my advice is that it is very likely that if you have a document that references 70E sections, is very likely that those sections have changed. So get over and take a look at your documentation and make sure that you don't have to make a modification there. All right, minor changes in the informational notes to accommodate style manuals in 130.5G. So in 130.5, we were talking about 130.5C. We had the title change, operating condition. There were some changes in the informational notes to accommodate the style manual. Please be aware, go back to 110.2B when required, because remember, the focus is moving around a little bit. Now, the normal operating equipment is a part of an exception number 1 for B when it's required to establish an electrically safe work condition. Okay, so, and in E, there were minor changes to the informational notes to accommodate style manuals. So E, in essence, didn't change. G, let's see, what did we do in G? There were some, I believe, general references to Article 130 were deleted to comply with the style manual again. So, and remember what the style manual tells us. Don't reference things when you don't need to. Don't need the pointers, just get it done. So that's that sometimes those are very useful. So I want to be careful because I am that's what they did. It's what the style manual says. But if you think about why you might find a pointer somewhere else in the code, it's normally because evidence has shown people are forgetting about it. But in general, remember, the code in these books are not for the untrained individual. I've heard that before, and I've been on the receiving end of that with some of my concepts and ideas. But that's the premise that they're going off of. So, again, my heart might be in a different place, but I'm just telling you where the code's heart's at. All right. All right, so, and then that was G. General references. Okay, so new informational note in 130.5G. Let's take a look at that. New informational note. What is the informational note? New informational note added to supplement existing text and requires instant energy analysis to be updated when changes occur in the electrical distribution system. Oh. That may have been a first draft change. It was a first draft change and it stayed. If you look at the parent text of, so G is your incident energy analysis. And what they're saying there is that I'd almost say this is a pretty good generic informational note. I'm going to read you the informational note. Changes that could affect the results of the incident energy analysis include changes made by utilities or other entities, such as transformer sizing, as well as modifications to protective devices or changes to protective settings. I could apply that to many things within 70E. That same informational note could be peppered throughout if you really think about it. It's not just associated with the incident energy analysis method. Let's take the PPE category method. You change an overcurrent protective device. If it's not a molded case circuit breaker and it's an insulated case circuit breaker, that changes your incident energy. That changes a lot about your hazard, right? So that informational note remained in the second draft. It was not changed or modified. What they did do in the second draft was they, again, added that word electric shock protection in note C to the table in G. Now, H, no changes in the second draft. All the changes were in the first draft, and all they did in H was add not a note. They added text that basically says, the label shall be of sufficient durability to withstand the environment involved. So that is what that is what the that's what the change was in H. The label has to be of sufficient durability to withstand the environment involved. So I don't know that that's earth-shattering, but that's the only change in H. All right, so arc flash risk assessment, I don't know, in my opinion, some minor changes, but overall, I think there were some significant, again, and we just took that journey, right? We took that journey going back to 110.2 and the title change of that estimate of the likelihood of an arc flash event. I think that is relatively significant. And the whole relocation and emphasis on establishing the electrical safe work condition, making those other conditions exception. I want to go back and just look at that. If we go back to 110.2, and I know there's another video on this, but I think it's worth the journey here. 110.2 says you have A is policy, and you have to document and implement an electrically safe work condition policy that requires hazard elimination to be the first priority, and that complies with 110.2b, which is when required, right? So what 110.2b tells us, energized electrical conductors and circuit parts operating at voltages equal to or greater than 50 volts, those have to be placed in electrically safe work condition when the employee is doing any of the following, and there's like a list of 7 items, I think only 7. Yes, 7 items, and then there's exceptions. They say if the employee is within the limited approach boundary, the employee interacts with equipment where conductors or circuit parts are not exposed, but increase the likelihood of an injury. There it is. That's where the exception is. It doesn't say to 2, but it's right after 2. So 2 says the employee interacts with equipment where conductors or circuit parts are not exposed, but an increased likelihood of injury from an exposure to an arc flash hazard exists. And it says exception number 1, normal operation of electrical equipment shall be permitted. So this is interacting with equipment that are not exposed, but an increased likelihood of injury. So the reason they put this in, it doesn't say exception number 1 to 2. It just says exception number 1, and it immediately follows item 2, which is the interaction with equipment. So it says normal operation of electrical equipment is permitted when you have a normal operating condition. And then it says, here's what a normal operating condition is, and we already read those. So the exception is when you are interacting with equipment where conductors or circuit parts are not exposed. So a good example, panel board, and you're going to open and close a circuit breaker, right? You're going to turn on and off a circuit breaker. You're going to open the little door. There's a dead front so that you don't have exposed. And it says, but an increased likelihood of injury from an exposure to an arc flash hazard exists. So on that panel board, for the likelihood or of injury from an exposure or to an arc flash hazard exists. It really doesn't tell you when you're conducting normal operation. I'm trying to figure out the tie between exception number 1 and this item 2, because if I have an arc flash hazard exists, I'd have to estimate. I'd have to say, look, this equipment, the conductors or circuit parts are not exposed, but I do have an increased likelihood of injury from an exposure to an arc flash hazard. I need to determine that there is a likelihood of injury from an exposure to an arc flash hazard. And then the exception says normal operation of electrical equipment shall be permitted where a normal operating condition exists, and it gives you those lists. And it says there's no evidence of impending failure. So I'm not sure if it's appropriate as an exception. I'd love to know your thoughts on that. Because the exception is to 2, which says that there is an increased likelihood of injury from an exposure to an arc flash hazard. If there is, the exception says that there isn't. I'm discovering this. This is somewhat live. I mean, it is recorded, but got to think about this. Take a look at that exception in 110.2b. It's exception number 1. And this used to be its own section. But it's in B, which says when it's required, when is it required to establish an electrically safe work condition? And it says when there's when you're interacting with equipment and there is a likelihood of injury due to arc flash. And the exception to that says, hey, if it's a normal operating condition and there's no evidence of impending failure. So if I look at all of those normal operating conditions, the equipment's properly installed, it's maintained, it's got the right short circuit current ratings and interrupting ratings, it's being used with regard to its instructions, all the doors are secured, there's no exposure to energized parts at all, and there's no evidence of impending failure, I would say that's not an exception to when an exposure to an arc flash hazard exists. What am I missing? I need your input on this. Take a look at that exception and tell me if it really fits there, or should it really be a 110.2 Charlie? I'm thinking. I'm just thinking. I'm just saying. But that's what it is. So that's what they did with that table, and I think that those changes are significant enough to warrant some more review. Your input is important. Hopefully, you will take up that challenge. All right, so let's get back to work. That was a nice little scenic tour of 130.5. Let's take a look at 130.7, personal and other protective equipment. Now, this is separated into 5 first-level subdivisions. General care of equipment, personal protective equipment, other protective equipment, and then standards for other protective equipment. And what you'll notice is your PPE category method in selecting PPE when you don't have an arc flash label from the previous section is in this section. And this is what I was saying. Would it be nice, or do you think it would be a cool thing for the future to include in the personal protective equipment, in the PPE selection, the selection of PPE, even if you did the 130.5 arc flash incident energy analysis method? We put that PPE selection up in 130.5. Anyway, let's walk through some of these changes. All right, so A and B informational note changes, if I'm not mistaken, very minor. You have the shock. They qualified the hazard with electric shock hazard instead of just shock hazards, and then they had some informational note changes in B to align with the style manual. So A and B, very mild, minor modifications, no change of intent, etc. Let's take a look at C, personal protective equipment. So now C is separated. C is separated into, I believe, is it just 5? No, it's more. 15. Yeah, 15. So C has 15 items in it. 1, general, and then 2, movement and visibility, head, face, and neck, eye protection, hearing protection, etc. So you have the general requirement. I have it highlighted as having changed. I have hearing protection as having changed. All right. So let's take a look. In 130.7 Charlie 1, there were a few items. So the big debate. The big debate in when selecting PPE is what happens when my incident energy is higher than anything that's available. I'm working on my service entrance equipment. It says 150 calories. I can't buy a 150 calorie outfit. And if I did, I wouldn't want to wear it, right? So what do? So they made some changes. In which section was it? In C1, they made some changes to the informational note. Because what does C1 tells us? What does C1 tell us? It says that when you're working within restricted approach boundary, you got to know what that is. The worker has to wear PPE in accordance with 130.4. When the employee is working within the arc flash boundary, you got to know what that is. He or she shall wear protective clothing and other PPE in accordance with 130.5. And it tells you that all parts of the body inside the arc flash boundary, this is where we get the back of the head in, have to be protected. It's not just about what's coming this way. It's all parts of the body. So, and a lot of people will say, well, I can just do a face and don't have to worry about the balaclava because I don't have to worry about the back of my head. But the moment your head goes inside that boundary, all right, and it comes back to this section. Now, the informational note was modified a little bit. This is where we say, when the incident energy is greater than the ARC rating of commercially available ARC rated PPE. And in my opinion, even if you could buy a 150 calorie outfit, you really got to say, do I want to wear it? Right? It is your choice. It is your choice. But you may want to look at this informational note to come up with some other ideas. It says what they changed was in item 1 of the informational note, it used to say use non-contact proximity test instruments or measurement of voltage on the secondary side of a low voltage transformer mounted in the equipment before using a contact test instrument to test for absence of voltage below 1,000 volts. So what they were trying to say before was, look, go to the secondary of this VT, this voltage transformer, and check there and do other things before you use a non-contact type of device. And they limited it to below 1,000 volts. So what the committee did this time, they said, look, we're gonna revise this. It got a lot of love, so to speak. they said use of non-contact, and it's not proximity test instruments, it's capacitive test instruments. That's what you're doing. It's a capacitor type of thing. They removed the measurement of voltage on the secondary side of a low voltage transformer. Now, we can have an argument or a debate about that, but they focused this in on just using a capacitive, non-contact, capacitive test instrument. And it says, or a permanently installed metering device in the equipment for indication. So one of the discussions that they had about this capacitive test instrument and the concerns was that on some of these medium voltage applications, you can have a lower voltage that capacitive sensor won't measure. So understand, I guess the bottom line is understand the limitations of the capacitive test instrument that you are using. Understand that there might be a bottom threshold to where there is a voltage higher than 50 volts present that device may not be able to detect. So understand, and regardless, even if that is not 100% accurate, because I'm just going based on the discussions. I have not been reading the instructions on these devices, but I'm just going on based on what I heard at that table. That was the discussion I'm relaying to you. But it is important to understand the capabilities of any of our measurement equipment. Even a permanently installed metering device will have some limitations. In the equipment for indication, and it says for indication, before using a contact type test instrument to test for the absence of voltage. And they removed the 1,000 volts because they said it doesn't matter. So what they want you to do, I look at this as layers of an onion. In your mind, you've got to look, what is your end goal? You need to take this piece of equipment, which you can't dress for, right? You can't dress for. And you need to figure out, how do I reduce my risk, likelihood, and severity? I can reduce the likelihood of me getting into an energized piece of equipment after turning it off to verify that it's at 0 volts by doing a bunch of different things. And what they're saying is, before you elect to walk up and put contact on, touch that possibly energized bus, use these other methods. That's basically where they're going here. And what you're doing is you're removing, you're peeling off those layers of the onion. And any one of these could give you a false positive or a false negative. But you are removing the layers of the onion so that when you finally are able to touch that bus with a meter to verify absence of voltage, you have increased the likelihood that it is safe. You've decreased the likelihood of an event. You can't change the severity. The only thing you can control at that point is likelihood. So that's the change they made. They added some clarity there. You might want to read that, especially if you are in those areas where you're working on equipment where you can't dress because there's no PPE available. So that's all I have to say about that. And now in hearing protection, the change they made in hearing protection was pretty simple. Remember, there was a requirement that said you had to have hearing protection and said when you're working inside the arc flash boundary. So what they said now is, look, you don't have to be working in the arc flash boundary. You just have to be merely in the arc flash boundary, and you need that hearing protection. So they removed the reference that you have to be working, because, I mean, I could say, I mean, technically, if you're in that arc flash boundary, you better be working. you even if you're observing, or you are, you should be an employed person who's getting paid for the hour, the 5 minutes, the 10 minutes, whatever, how many minutes that you are in that arc flash boundary. You shouldn't be on vacation and say, hey, I'm going to an arc flash boundary today. Okay, so we can have that debate, but they removed that reference of working, and they basically just said, if you are inside that arc flash boundary for any reason, you need your hearing protection. The same way you need PPE, and that's a part of PPE, not just those who are working. Because your perception of what work is and my perception of what work is could be two different things. And in my opinion, they probably very well are two different things. All right, so then those were the changes. Those were the only changes in oh shoot, okay. Those were the changes in A, B, and C, D, and E. I'm sorry, C, C, general and hearing protection. I was flipping around. I didn't even realize it. The 7, so hand and arm protection. There was some changes there. There was a discussion about the gauntlet. And that's not something that if you were a pirate that you had to walk. This is about those rubber insulated gloves and the cuffs that are above the leather. So you have the leather protectors, and then you have the rubber insulated gloves, and the rubber insulated gloves have to extend beyond the leather protectors. So all they did was add some clarity, and in my opinion, they did not change much in that regard. And I think most of those changes occurred in the first draft. So we talked about that in a different video, but in the table 130.7 Charlie 7A, we said the distances between gauntlet and cuff minimum. They changed that to distances between protector cuff and rubber insulated glove cuff minimum. And I like the protector cuff. Remember the outer, and I can't call them leathers anymore because they may not be leather. Okay, that was the other point that they pointed out. That was the other point that they made in the changes this cycle, is that I could have something that's not leather. And they actually added another standard in the standards reference table. So that protector has a cuff, and there has to be a minimum distance between the end of that protector and the end of the rubber insulation. They want that rubber insulated to stick out, and they have those distances based upon the class of glove, which is driven by the voltage that you're working on. So the higher the voltage, the more rubber insulation that they want exposed outside of the leather, outside of the protectors. It's just so easy to say leather protectors, but we can't say leather protectors anymore. They're just a protector because they made that clear this cycle. I'm just looking at second draft. They highlighted electric shock protection, not just shock protection. All right, and in 8, they added an informational note in 8. Or actually, they didn't add it, they modified it, and I believe they removed the reference to ASTM 2413. Why'd they do that? The standard reference was deleted because attempting to correlate the information in the note with the revised 2020 NEC style manual requirements was confusing. So they were confused, but they removed that reference. So they just said electrical hazard, EH footwear can provide a secondary source of electric shock protection under dry conditions. That's all they said. They removed the reference to the footwear meeting the requirements of ASTM 2413. I think I know. It's almost like a requirement. So I remember this discussion. This was the battle they were having. How do you reword this to say it has to meet 2413 to be considered an additional layer of shock hazard when under dry conditions, when you can't put a mandatory requirement in an informational note? And if you tried to make it a mandatory requirement, you can't reference another standard. So to try to meet the style manual, they said that they could not do it. I think that they can. Next cycle, we're going to have to give this some love. Electrical hazard EH footwear can provide a secondary source of electric shock protection under dry conditions. So the informational note, the intent hasn't changed, the reference to the standard has changed, and it was rewritten to align with the style manual. So, and then out of the last few for this, we're coming up, I believe, close to the end. Care and maintenance of ARC-rated clothing and rated. Aligned style manual changes in 13. Very easy. 14, standards for PPE. This is that new standard ASTM. They made some modifications to the informational notes to align with the style manual, but they added ASTM F3258, which was published in 2021, recognizing non-leather protectors for rubber gloves to correlate with the global revisions made on this topic. So the title of ASTM 3258 is the standard specification for protectors for rubber insulated gloves meeting specific performance requirements. So it's the bottom line is they may not be leather. So can't call them leather protectors. I know you might be in the same bucket as I am. I'm always saying, don't forget to wear your leathers. Don't forget to put the leathers on. Now it's don't forget to wear the protectors. I like leathers better. But anyway, it is what it is. And then 15, Arc Flash PPE category method, there was an informational notes 1 and 2 were relocated. So informational note 1, and we talked about one of these already, was relocated to follow the parent text of 130.7 Charlie 15, because it applies to both AC and DC systems. So one informational note that was under AC also applies to DC, so they put that under the parent text of 130.7 Charlie 15 instead of just to 130.7 Charlie 15B. The other informational note was relocated to follow section 130.5B because it applies to all arc flash risk assessments. And it's not is it 130.5B? Yeah, it was 130. Remember we talked about that, or was it 130.2B? Hold on. I want to make sure. Yeah, 130.5B. It was 110 that eliminated the D. So anyway, 130.5B, remember we already talked about that informational note, and this is where it came from because it applies to arc flash, which we could argue and debate that one every day of the week and twice on Sunday. Let's talk about 130.7, and that will be where we end this discussion. So 130.7 is personal and other protective equipment. So insulated tools and equipment and barriers both saw some changes. There were some slight changes to align with the style manual throughout. I will say that some of those occurred in 1. And the only change in informational in D2 was regard to the informational note to align with the style manual. But now the other thing that they did change in D1, insulated tools and equipment. I'm just going to call that up. 130.7, David. Wow. You know, it's amazing how long these sections are. In my opinion, they need to figure out a way to break this up. Anyway, the They add the clarity, electric shocks, not just for shock, but they modified 3D. So it's D1. Remember, D is protective equipment. 1 is insulated tools and equipment. And then it says that the tools and handling equipment used within restricted approach boundary shall be insulated. Insulated tools shall be protected from damage to the insulating material. And then there's an A, requirements for insulated tools. There's a B, fuse or fuse holder handling equipment. There is a C, which is ropes and hand lines. And then D, fiberglass reinforced plastic rods. This is what changed. And you're going to see this change in two places, one in the informational notes as well. So the change here is not around the rods. It's around, I would almost say enforcement, but it says fiberglass reinforced plastic rod and tube used for live line tools shall meet the requirements of applicable, and what it used to say, portions of electrical dealing with electrical installation requirements. It doesn't make sense. Portions of electrical dealing with electrical installation requirements, period. They removed that and said that the line tools shall meet the requirements of applicable state, federal, or local codes and standards. And then they modified the informational note 1 where for ASTM F711 to talk about visual inspection and testing of fiberglass enforced plastic rods and tubes. And I think is just why you would reference that. But that first change, state, federal, or local codes and standards. So they're referencing that these fiberglass reinforced plastic rod and tubes used for live line tools have to meet the requirements of applicable state, federal, or local codes and standards, which implies that states, federal, or local codes and standards may have differing requirements or may have special requirements. I don't know the details on that, but that's the way they went. The informational note just tells you to, if you're going to go look at F711, that sounds cool. It's for more information concerning the visual inspection and testing of fiberglass reinforced plastic rods and tubes. And then they made a minor change in E, portable ladders, the informational note, just to align with the style manual. So those were the changes. Those were the changes in the in 70E up through, we did all of Chapter 1 and Article 90 now. In these two sessions, we did all of Chapter 1 and Article 90. It gave you a good overview of what occurred, this second draft, and where we're at, basically, in regard to 70E as we move into the next phase for this cycle. I am 7 minutes over my allotted time. I'm going to get off, go and upload this. So I really appreciate all that you and guys and gals out there do. And I appreciate you spending an hour with me today on Tuesday for another Tech Tuesday of IAEI News Live. Please subscribe to the YouTube channel, hit that bell, and I'm looking forward to being a co-member with you of the IAEI. So get your membership up to date. A lot of great value there, and hopefully I will see you at a future IAEI meeting. All right. So thank you. Thanks for what you do for the electrical industry. Thanks for what you do for electrical safety, especially. And remember to stay safe and please stay healthy. Until next week, catch you later.